I'm recording this presentation so that we can offer it to those who could not attend. Before we get to our main speaker and presentation, I would like to introduce a few people who are with us tonight and our resources for you in the community. First is Dr. Tim Lawrence. He's Associate Professor and County Director for WSU Extension in Island County. Tim, would you like to say a words about Extension in Island County? And perhaps I have muted you. Try now.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, well, my video is still off, but welcome everybody. I'm very glad that we're able to offer you this tonight, and the WSU Extension is be able to provide you with the type of program that we do provide. And just want to encourage anyone who's interested, regardless of your interest, be it 4-H or environmental education or any other aspect, including seeking 4-credit degrees, we can probably help you out. And we have the Island County commissioners to thank for that. Tonight's speaker, Ani, I've known Ani for almost 20 years now, since we were grad students together at The Ohio State University. And I was impressed with Ani from the very start, in that I worked primarily as a stormwater extension agent throughout all of Ohio. And I dealt with a lot of jurisdictional engineers and trying to explain concepts of alternative stormwater. And Ani explained a concept to me which I was having trouble understanding, namely what hungry water was and how it the traditional methods of stormwater control actually contributed to stream degradation. And in literally less than 30 or 40 seconds, he just explained the concept so clearly that when I went and talked to these jurisdictional engineers after that, I actually sounded like I knew what I was talking about. So I'm really pleased. Ani's he's been at Washington State University for about 5 years, was in Clemson University prior to that, and that's where he went right after Ohio State University. He was recently promoted to full professor, and that's only 5 years after starting here as an assistant. So he's not only a PhD, but he's also a professional engineer, and he has a great deal of knowledge. So we're really happy to have Ani with us. And with that, turn it over to Janet.
Thank you, Tim. Apologize for the video screen not working. Working on the settings. I think the rest of the speakers should be able to turn their video on. So next, I would like to welcome Island County Commissioner for District 3, Janet St. Clair. Commissioner, thank you for attending tonight. Would you like to say a few words about the new administrative building and other things that are happening over on Camano and in your district?
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm pretty excited about the topic you're offering today, in part because I think our efforts to educate people on stormwater runoff and to offer options that can help us address solutions such as what we've put in the Camano administration building and the landscaping there. I think it is an educational opportunity that can't be missed. I'm real proud of the new Camano admin building. We were in temporary buildings for both the administration and the sheriff for, I don't know, 20 or 40 years. We were in those temporary buildings. And so behind me, you see the Jack Archibald building, which is a feature of the new building. We are incredibly grateful to Jack for his artwork and generous donation to the building. I think what makes me proud about the new Camano admin building is with that and some staffing changes we've made, we're able to offer the same level of service to the constituents on Camano Island that have been available here on Whidbey for a while. And that's important. Access to government is important to me, and the ability to serve people who live in my own community with such a beautiful space. And I look forward to being able to share it as we move through these more challenging times. So thank you for having me. I look forward to the topic, and I will let you move on to Geraldine.
Thank you, Commissioner St. Clair. Also with us, also with WSU Extension in Island County is our Camano coordinator and Shore Stewards program coordinator, Geraldine Ritzman. Geraldine, could you tell us a little bit about the Shore Stewards program?
Yes, good evening, everyone, and happy Earth Week. I know we have a lot to get through tonight, but I wanted to take a few minutes to introduce you briefly to the Shore Stewards program if you're not familiar. It is an educational program that's primarily geared towards shoreline landowners or people who live along bluffs, but don't let that stop you if you live further inland. Living on an island as narrow as Camano, everyone lives within just a mile or two of the shore. And our watersheds, most of them do lead out into the sound. And so individual decisions that you make on your property regarding the topics that we're learning about tonight, the low impact development and green stormwater, they do have an impact. So as part of the program, we offer a peer-reviewed 80-page manual that goes over 10 guidelines to shoreline living, and several of those are very relevant to what we're learning about tonight. And I also put out quarterly newsletters that cover every topic under the sun. I'm on issue 130 is about to come out, so several of those are also very relevant to the topics tonight. And I also look forward to getting back to in-person workshops, hopefully in the near future. But if you'd like to join the email list, or you can follow us on Facebook, but you can contact me. I'll type my contact info into the chat, and feel free to reach out whenever you have any questions about your property. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Geraldine. And with us tonight from the Snohomish Conservation District is Communication Program Manager Catherine Wells. Catherine, would you like to tell us a little bit about the Conservation District's stormwater programs for Camano residents?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. Yes, we have a team that focuses specifically on green stormwater infrastructure, low impact development. We kind of use those terms interchangeably, but basically ways to manage stormwater so that in our developed environment, we can in some ways mimic the processes of the natural environment where the rainwater is slowed and filtered before it reaches our groundwater or our surface waters. In our developed environment, everything moves very fast. You'll learn more about that. And we need to put in things, plants and structures to help keep that from moving so fast and taking all the pollutants from our developed environment and discharging them to our surface waters. So we have technical assistance that's free. We will come out to your home, observe social distancing and wear a mask as long as that is necessary, to help you decide, what would work best for you. Do you need or want a rain garden? What about a rainwater harvesting system? Or a native planting, a buffer along your ditch, for example, to keep the water from your lawn from running off into the ditch nearby. We have people that can come out and help you with that. We even have an engineer on staff, Jayakaran. So please give us a call. I can put my contact information in the chat if you like, and enjoy tonight's program. Thank you again for having me.
Very good, thank you, Catherine. And if you're joining us tonight from off of Camano Island, you can check with your local conservation district, your local county conservation district, and see what kind of programs and services they offer as well. Let's move on to our main presentation for the evening. Dr. Anand Jayakaran is a professor in the College of Agricultural, Human, and Natural Resource Sciences for Washington State University Extension. Ani has a BE in Civil Engineering from India, an MS in Civil Engineering, and PhD in Agricultural and Biological Engineering, both from The Ohio State University. He is based at the Research and Extension Center in Puyallup and does extension and research related to managing stormwater in urbanizing watersheds using low impact development and green stormwater infrastructure. Ani, thank you very much for being here with us tonight. And I will stop sharing and allow you to begin.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I am going to share my screen and hopefully that'll work. Do you see my slide?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
And if before you start,
yeah.
I was going to say, if people have questions, how would you like to handle those? Would you like to have them write them in the chat and we'll answer them afterwards?
Yeah, that sounds good, Lauren.
Okay.
And then I think I'll try to save some time at the end for some questions as well. So if we run out of questions in the chat, we can do some live questions if that's possible.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for making the time to be here. I want to say a big thank you to Ron for organizing this and for Tim for the invite. Like Tim said, I've known him for many, many years. I count him as a friend, a source of great and sage advice. In fact, it was because of Tim that I moved out west from Clemson University to Washington State University. So I owe him a lot. And when he asked me to share this, share a little bit of knowledge that I have on bioretention and bioswales and plants, I jumped to the opportunity. I will say that plants are not my forte, so I will speak briefly about them, but I know there are several master gardeners coming up after me that I know will fill in whatever gaps I leave. So again, my name is Jayakaran, and I'm based out of the Puyallup Research and Extension Center and the Washington Stormwater Center. I want to be clear also that our mission at WSU Extension, we have our mission statement says, our job is to engage people, organizations, communities to advance knowledge, economic well-being, and quality of life by fostering inquiry, learning, and the application of research. And that's what Tim, I, and several of us in Extension do. We live that and we breathe that work. I, as an engineer, prefer equations or like to come up with equations. So one idea that we've been all toying around with is that to increase adoption of certain practices, good practices in managing stormwater, it's a combination of education and regulation. And there's always that intangible part of an equation, the error terms or the uncertainty in those equations. And in our case, when it comes to managing stormwater and adopting good practices to manage stormwater, that uncertainty is usually tied with how communities perceive stormwater, how they perceive the practices that we put out, how people relate to them. And so a lot of our work is not only about educating folks about the science and the engineering behind stormwater management, it's also understanding how people relate to these systems. Because as you will see, these are not systems that are just built, engineered in place, and then you can walk away from. The human component is very important. So for people to understand and appreciate these systems is critical. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is lower the cost of compliance. So we're trying to make it easier for counties, for cities and jurisdictions to adopt these stormwater management processes and make it easier for them. But ultimately, it's about cost and how do we make sure that the burden of managing stormwater is not too costly. So having said that, I also want to be sure that I really give a big shout out to Island County and their facilities crew for the work that they did at the Camano building. I know it's been, a long journey for a lot of people talking about stormwater and managing stormwater effectively. And the fact that you guys have built it and that it's in place means that so much of that effort has paid off and you guys are so far ahead of the curve. Okay, so I'll start off with some basic hydrology 101. What happens when you convert the landscape from a forest to a city or an urbanized development, a shopping mall, you name it. So I'll kind of walk my way through this schematic. So in the top left corner of that original schematic, this is what a forest looks like. When rainfall lands on that landscape, about 40%, these are all approximate numbers. It depends on the climate, depends on the landscape, depends on the type of vegetation. But 40% of rainfall returns back into the atmosphere in the form of evapotranspiration. Evapotranspiration is evaporation, so water going straight back into the atmosphere from the ground. And transpiration is the process by which water goes through the leaves, through the trees, up back into the atmosphere. So those are a pathway that water returns back into the atmosphere. 10% of that rainfall ends up as what we call runoff. Runoff is water that runs across the surface of the landscape and ends up in the nearest stream or river or pond or lake nearby. So that's called surface runoff, and that's about 10%. Again, these numbers are approximate. But 25% goes what's known as shallow infiltration. Infiltrates into the soil and then makes its way laterally, again, ending up either in a stream or in a pond or in a lake or whatever the lowest water area where water collects is. And then about 25% infiltrates and heads to the groundwater and some form of long-term deep water storage. Okay, so this is what a forest looks like. As you start urbanizing that landscape, you put a house on, those numbers start to change. And the thing that I want you to pay most attention to is this idea of runoff. So now you have 20% runoff. Now you have about double the amount of water that was before either infiltrating into the soils, it's heading closer to the nearest stream. So you've got a larger amount of water going to the stream. And as you start building out this landscape, the amount of water that shows up as runoff in a nearby stream gets more and more. And the idea is when you seal the surface of the landscape off by creating, either it's building houses or putting pavements down or building roads, by sealing off that landscape, you are also essentially sealing off the path that water normally takes into the soils. Instead, it's heading off to the stream nearby. So here you've got 30% runoff. You go to a full kind of city, highly urbanized landscape, we got 75 to 100% impervious surface. Impervious surface is essentially just that sealed surface that you get. Concrete roofs, all those are called impervious surfaces. Now you've got almost 55% runoff. And so what happens is now as you've converted this landscape from what was once a forest to this city or parking lot or subdivision, you have essentially moving all this water that would have normally infiltrated into the soils. You're trying to move them laterally across the landscape to the nearby streams. And a stream, like most systems, are designed or they have evolved to deal with a certain amount of flow. As you start putting lots of more water into those streams, they just can't handle it. And what typically happens, streams start to widen, they start to deepen, and they just essentially start to degrade because they can't handle all this runoff that's coming to them, all this water that's heading to them. So the processes that we will be talking about today are how do we, in essence, even though we're living on this landscape and we've transformed it, how do we recreate some of that original forested hydrology? How do we get more water to slow down by going into the ground or by going up through the trees and through vegetation? How do we prevent this huge amounts of runoff heading to the stream really quickly? There's also another problem with all this runoff going to the stream. It also carries all the stuff that we put on the landscape, whether it's over-fertilizing our lawns, whether it's stuff coming off our cars in our driveways, whether it's just people not picking up after their pets. All this stuff basically ends up in the stream because water is essentially the ultimate transporter of stuff from one place to another. So this is what you see after a huge storm event. You will see water courses on the landscape being, filled with these visible pollutants. And in this case, you can see a lot of sediment, this plume of sediment associated with this stormwater outfall. So, but there's also a lot of stuff that gets washed off the landscape that you don't actually see. And this is a bunch of emerging contaminants. They're called emerging contaminants. They can be everything that ranges from caffeine to antidepressants, surfactants, metals, hormones, all kinds of things. So it's quite the toxic soup that ends up in the streams and the ponds that are downstream of the places that we live. So we have a huge problem to deal with. I want to talk quickly, devote a few slides to some of these problems so that everybody fully appreciates kind of the magnitude of the issue at hand. I hope this video is playing on your screen, but the video should be showing a stormwater outfall with pollutants streaming out of that stormwater outfall. This is a stormwater outfall out in the Puget Sound, and I think it's associated with a part of Seattle, but you can see how much of stuff just gets washed out into the sound. This is a buried stormwater outfall, and this is a time lapse. If you look at the image on the right, the map with all the blue dots on it, those individual dots are all individual stormwater outfalls. So all the water that falls on the landscape, that falls on our roofs, on our lawns, on our driveways, they all get piped through the storm and curb inlets that we have on our roads and landscape, and they all end up on these being basically washed out untreated into Puget Sound. This is typically how stormwater is managed across the world. It essentially just moves into the pipes and it gets shipped to the nearest stream, downstream. So what happens when all these pollutants end up in the nearest stream? This is some work that a colleague of mine, Jen McIntyre at the Washington Stormwater Center, does some amazing work, and I'm actually going to show a little bit of her work to kind of show what the issues are. The biggest issue that they were able to identify was this issue of pre-spawn mortality. There were all these urban streams where they were finding these fish that were completely full of salmon spawn, and they were dying before they were able to spawn. So there's some video here on this slide that show this behavior of these fish that are basically on their way out. They are reacting to something in the water that's basically killing them before they can spawn. And so there was a lot of work that happened at the Puyallup Research and Extension Center and with other collaborating partners at NOAA and Fish and Wildlife, trying to figure out what was it in this urban stormwater that was killing these fish. And then they started to figure out some ideas started to come together. And this is just one of those ideas. It seemed like this is a mortality map of coho salmon. And it shows where predicted mortality of if salmon ended up in these streams on the map. If they were in streams that were marked in pink, they had the highest chance of mortality before they spawn. And then the yellow 10 to 40%, and then the green were less than 10%. So they were seeing that all these like watersheds on the landscape were associated with these kinds of mortality of these coho. And then they did an analysis of what was happening on those landscapes that was associated with this mortality. And in the figure that I want to highlight, basically they found that the highest mortality was associated with roads and road networks. So if you had streams or watersheds that had a lot of principal arterial or interstates in those watersheds or on those landscapes were associated with high coho mortality. So they started to gravitate towards this idea, okay, so what's coming off roads is probably the cause of this spike in mortalities of coho salmon. So what happens on roads? On roads, you have all these pollutants. You have tire wear, exhaust, brake, material, washer fluid, all this stuff comes off. You got leaks. So they started to think, okay, it's got to be one of these like potential like culprits that are causing this, or something in these suite of pollutants that are possibly linked to the death of these coho salmon. All of this led to, in 2021, earlier this year, was this pretty groundbreaking paper that Jen and colleagues from UW published in Science, no less, which is, for many of us, the holy grail of, publications. So in Science, they basically tracked a chemical that's in tire wear. When tires wear down, there's this chemical that's released, and they identified that chemical as tires break down as the source of this toxic compound. And that compound is called 6-ppd quinone. And they went through this elaborate procedure of trying to figure out what that compound was. And I won't go through this, but I really suggest if you feel like it and are feeling adventurous to read this paper. They start on the left side of this image. They started off with tire wear particulate leachate. So they ground up tires, put them in water, and they found that fish died almost immediately. You just put a piece of old tire into an aquarium, and the coho salmon were dead within 24 hours. So they worked their way out from left to right, and they went through all this incredible high process analytical procedures, and they ultimately came to this one compound called 6-ppd quinone. And so this 6-ppd quinone is the smoking gun, and there's a lot of it out in the environment. And this is just one of their graphics from that paper. I'll highlight is that the LC50 on the bottom of that screen it shows is basically the lethal dose for quinone, 6-ppd quinone for juvenile coho. It's about 0.8 to 1.5 micrograms per liter in water. When you consider a multi-lane road runoff, water coming off a multi-lane road, their estimate is that the amount of quinone, 6-ppd quinone is 0.8 to 19 micrograms per liter. Once it gets dissolved in a stream and gets transported further downstream, it's about between 0.2 and 3.5 micrograms per liter. But the dangerous kind of critical threshold is about 0.8 to 1.5. So essentially, we have this huge problem by something that we use and is so ubiquitous in our urban environment, which is tire wear particles. So a big challenge we have. Apologies for that errant animation. But what it turns out is that green stormwater infrastructure or low impact development is able to strip not only 6-ppd quinone, but a bunch of other toxicants out of stormwater. So that's what we're going to talk about, and that's what the bioswales that you see, you'll see at the building. It's essentially this combination of plants, vegetation, and soils, and that if you run stormwater through those, you end up with cleaner water. And that's this idea called bioretention. Bioretention, bioswales are another form of bioretention. But this idea of running stormwater through plants, vegetation, and soils is what we will from now on call bioretention. And it's part of this greater idea or this concept of green stormwater infrastructure. It's also known as low impact development. I will say bioretention, bioswales, biofilters, they're all used somewhat interchangeably. Bioretention is only one form of green stormwater infrastructure. And if you look at the schematic at the bottom, you'll see there are other types of green stormwater infrastructure. Permeable pavements, green roofs, rain tanks. They're all different forms of this idea of how do we store and treat stormwater using more natural processes so that we can limit their impact on downstream waters. I like this quote a lot. It says, rethink stormwater, treat stormwater as a resource. Okay, so basic idea of bioretention. You've got soils and plants, and you divert stormwater runoff to this system of soils and plants. Water percolates through those soils, comes in contact with the plants and the plant roots, and then infiltrates to either deeper groundwater, or it goes laterally to the nearest stream as shallow infiltration flow. And that water tends to be a lot cleaner and devoid of a lot of the pollutants that originally started in the stormwater flow. You do have occasions when the system gets completely overwhelmed, when you have huge storm events and much greater than what the bioretention or the bioswale can handle. And that water runs right off the surface and ends up typically going untreated and heading downstream. So it's really important that the bioretention system is designed to be able to handle fairly large flows. At the building right now, there is what's known as an overflow structure, so that if the system does fill up much faster than it can handle, there's like a beehive that allows overflows to flow into it, and then it flows out of the system. So here we have a system that comprises of soils, plants, water, which comes into that. But amongst the most critical aspects of green stormwater infrastructure systems is the human aspect. The human aspect is essentially making sure that the system survives, that it's maintained, taken care of, plants don't die, and people feel that it becomes a worthwhile investment. One of the biggest failures of green stormwater infrastructure systems is, especially for bioretention, is when people walk away from them and they end up being filled with weeds and overgrown by invasives. What typically happens is people complain, they're like, wow, this is full of weeds, it's an eyesore, please get rid of it. And then typically what happens, the local jurisdiction will come in, remove all the weeds, plant grass, and walk away, and it no longer functions the way it was meant to. So the human aspect is critical, and I'm so glad the Master Gardeners are here to talk about that, because they represent that element, the most critical element of green stormwater infrastructure. is the people that live and maintain these systems, live around and maintain these systems. Okay, so standard bioretention system, this is a little more dressed up version of the schematic I showed earlier. You have vegetation, you have a bioretention soil media, and you have an underdrain and outlet at the bottom. Not all bioretention systems have underdrains in them, but the system at the building does, and it's not uncommon to have underdrains. Usually it's a function of the soils, the native soils that the systems are built within. If the native soils are conducive for infiltration, if they're not contaminated soils, then typically you won't see the underdrain, and water enters the system from the flow entrance. You can see on the top left, flows through, makes contact with the vegetation, flows through the soil, bioretention soil media, and then slowly percolates into this or infiltrates into the native soils below. So this is there are various designs for this. I need to speed up a bit. So the three basic functions: infiltrate stormwater, retain pollutants, and support plant growth. Okay, so the two big components, the design components of these bioretention systems, bioswales, are the soils. And why soils are critical is because they harbor this ecosystem that is capable of removing pollutants out of stormwater. The combination of microbes, bacteria, fungi, all of them work together to break down the pollutants that's in stormwater. Not only do they break it down, soils will also just act like a giant filter and hold back particulates or more solid material that's in stormwater, thereby cleaning it out. I wanted to show this contrast of what native soils look like. This is what a native soil out in the forest look like. These are what urban soils look like. Urban soils tend to be devoid of a lot of the microbes. And this usually happens because they're built on fill. They have a lot less infiltration. They have a lot less plant and rooting material in them. But the most critical part that I wanted to point out is soils offer this huge potential for the exchange of pollutants. So pollutants can come in, and you have all these like active sorption points that can exchange pollutant chemicals out of the stormwater and have them be retained within the soil. They also have all these like kind of incredible numbers of bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, worms, that all of these act together to create an ecosystem that break down these pollutants that go through these systems. And this is why we use soils, and this is why soils are so effective in removing pollutants out of stormwater. I love this graphic. It shows 10 grams of soil contains about 1.2 quintillion exchange sites that can be used for pollutant removal. But because these are engineered systems, and because we want these soils to have a certain ability to move water through them, so the suggestion is not just to take any soils, it's to create these bioretention, especially bioretention soils. And in the state of Washington, it comprises a 40%, 60% mix of sand and compost. So 40% by volume of compost with 60% by volume of sand. And this is quite a lot of sand. So you'll find that bioretention soils don't in many ways, don't really function that well as compared to normal soils. But because of all the sand in them, they will allow water to infiltrate through them, and you tend to not have ponding in bioretention soils. It's critical not to have ponding, water standing around. So the 60-40 mix is pretty standard around the state of Western Washington. And we are working with the Department of Ecology. They actually specified this mix. I have to make sure that I'm watching time, and I can't believe it's already 7:40. So I'll be quick. But where plants come into the process is the plants create the ecosystem. They enhance the ecosystem, the soil ecosystem, in terms of being able to manage pollutants that come in. This graphic is, I was just blown away by this study by Kafle et al. And they just show how this one set of roots in this plant is able to maximize the extraction of phosphate from the soils. And I won't go into it. I had a bunch of notes written on it, but I won't go into it. But basically what this graphic shows, if you go from A, B, C, D, it shows essentially that the soil and the root structure and the combination of fungi that work with the roots. You have these fungi that actually grow into the roots and then put out these hyphae, or these strand-like hairs that are able to capture phosphate particles that are too far for the root hairs in the rhizosphere to bring in. They grow these hairs out into the soil, and then they capture these insoluble phosphates that are out of reach of the plants, the root structure, which would normally be out of reach of the root structure, and bring those down into the actual plant, into the root vessels of the root, into the cells of the root. And so there are a couple of types of mycorrhizae that do this, and fungi, and then there's also a type of bacteria which will actually go out and source these phosphates, dissolve them, and then bring them back into the plant roots. And actually, fungi is these amazing piece to this whole puzzle, because they grow these hyphae, and those hyphae are these root-like hairs, these hair-like structures that bacteria use like a superhighway to travel back and forth in the soils. Because of the hyphae are so thin, they tend to absorb water to their systems, and then the bacteria are able to use that, the water associated with those hyphae to move back and forth. So there's all this incredible stuff that's going on completely out of sight. But this is why plants are a critical aspect to this. All right. So 3 parts of what plants do: they build soil structure, they increase infiltration rates, and they improve nutrient removal. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide. This slide basically just shows that we can tweak various design aspects of bioretention systems to remove specific aspects of pollutants. So we want to remove phosphorus, then we might potentially tweak it a certain way. Nitrates, you want to tweak it a certain way. I will say that the science is still pretty new, and there's a lot of research still going on actively. There are some aspects of pollutants that we're not able to pull out very effectively. Nitrates are pretty hard to do. So I wanted to talk really quickly about what we do in Extension. We bring people to the science, and we ask community, what is it that is important to you that we can work on? And so the human, like I said earlier, the human aspect is the most critical part. I work out of the Washington Stormwater Center. It's in Puyallup. These are some of the testing research facilities that I work on. We're currently in those 16 kind of cells that you see with over here, lined with that tarp. Those cells, we're actually looking at different kinds of mulches to see how mulch impacts bioretention and bioswales. How do different kinds of mulch improve the removal of certain pollutants from bioswales? We also have a bunch of training programs that are done online. So we have an LID operations and maintenance training program where we have several online modules that people can watch and then do a little test, and they get a certificate of completion. All of this to basically put the word out that bioswales, bioretention, green stormwater infrastructure are a critical aspect of what we do to manage stormwater. Okay, so quick thank you for listening. I know I may have sped through a few concepts kind of quickly. I would love to hear some questions if there's time for it. I also want to be sure that I really miss doing this. I did a similar talk in Island County 4 years ago, and the highlight of that talk was, of course, meeting people, but also getting to hang out with Tim and Toby. So I just wanted to put this up there, Tim. Hopefully soon, when we're all vaccinated and the world is a safer place, we can do this again. with that, I really thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions you may have for me.
Great, thank you so much, Ani. Do we have some questions from the audience? You can feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself. Commissioner St. Clair.
Thank you for that. I just had a chance to hear that salmon study recently in a presentation, and it excited me tremendously because it was so definitive in what we can do and some policy solutions that are not tremendously hard to just change the way in which our tires are made and can have such an impact. So thank you for that. Appreciate the presentation on pollutants. My question is about one of the issues that most often comes to me is the impact of flooding with stormwater management. And, you know, when we started developing 25 years ago, no one anticipated that. Can you talk about stormwater management, or is that a different topic for a different day, to reduce flooding and sort of the energy by which water moves?
Yeah, I can do that. Actually, that is where I started my work, is dissipation of energy in agricultural streams. So how do you dissipate the huge energy that's associated with when you change the way water flows? So the green stormwater infrastructure and low impact development are actually designed to mitigate flooding. Originally, the idea that they were to put them out there was actually to make everybody responsible for their own management of stormwater. So if you were able to distribute rain gardens and bioretention and bioswales across the landscape effectively, you put a rain garden in most people's houses, then the impact on the downstream receiving waters are a lot less. I will also be careful. I will also have to say that, you know, green stormwater infrastructure is not a silver bullet. You know, there are occasions when it is not appropriate, and you still need to resort to conventional gray infrastructure, which is your standard detention, retention pipes and large regional facilities, you know. So there are, you know, so I feel like there is a combination of those two types of events, those two types of structures that need to be put out on the landscape. Certainly green stormwater infrastructure is not going to, you know, prevent huge, like when you have like the 500-year storm. I worked in South Carolina, and just after I left, actually, they got hit by all these huge storm events, and green stormwater infrastructure is not going to, it may blunt a little bit the impact, but you still have to have some traditional engineering in place to manage the big storms. But for the majority of the smaller, more frequent storms, green stormwater infrastructure offers huge possibilities. But it's just getting people to adopt them, and then also be able to, for people to take care of the maintenance. You know, those green stormwater infrastructure practices, once they become weed pits, nobody wants them around, you know, anymore. So those are the two big challenges.
Thank
Okay,
you.
great. There was another question. Did you have a follow-up, Janet? No, okay. There's another question in the chat. Can we use the impact of stormwater management and bioswales on residential lots?
Yes, the answer is yes. There is a version of bioswales or bioretention that is appropriate for residential lots. That's what we refer to as rain gardens. They're very similar, and I believe Captain was talking about rain gardens and Snohomish Conservation District, and I know Jayakaran really well. They do an amazing job, and that is exactly what a rain garden for your home, a bioswale on your residential lot on a private property is a rain garden, and it's essentially an area where you divert water that comes off your lawn, comes off your roof, off your driveway. You divert water to it, you put plants and you put soil in it, and it's able to manage that water, strip pollutants out of it, and then it lets the water slowly infiltrate into the groundwater or to the nearest stream nearby, and takes care of most of the pollutants in that water. Great question.
There's a very, Wsu Extension has a very good site on rain gardens. I'm going to post a link to that in the chat. They offer a very large free PDF that you can use to design and offer some plant lists as well for your rain garden. So there's a link for that. Any other questions?
I see a direct question about design. What is your design? What is your goal to remove runoff or decrease runoff for your bioswale design? I will tell you that engineers who design bioswales, that's the first thing that they start off with is what is the design runoff that you're creating your system around. So the soils are the soils and the outlet control, all of those are modified to basically ensure that you have what's known as a pre-development runoff regime. And it's based on the idea that if your watershed was, or your drainage area, or the area that's producing the water was partially forested, what would it look like? So there is it's pretty rigorous, but there is a design standard for that. So it's called a pre-development hydrology standard.
Okay, any
Thank
other
you.
questions? Nope, all right. Well, Ani, thank you so much for that very interesting and educational profession. It's really, it's amazing that, without the scientists and researchers looking at why these coho were dying, it'd just be a mystery. So it's kind of somewhat comforting to know that there are very talented people out there helping to come up with solutions to some of these our impacts on the environment. So thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. And we are going to move on to the last part of our presentation for the evening. We're going to hear from some master gardeners. Let's see, this one. Make sure, okay, very good. So for our final segment, we're going to hear from some Island County master gardeners about some of the plants that were chosen for the landscaping around the new Camano administrative building. WSU Extension master gardeners are community volunteers who share research-based gardening information and environmental stewardship practices within our communities. Oops, I jumped ahead, sorry. We've had a great time, and we're going to be featuring some of our master gardeners on Camano Island tonight, who are going to talk about some of these plants that were chosen. So in the past 2 years, the WSU Extension Master Gardener Program has identified a number of program priorities that address critical issues facing Washington State residents. And the plants that our master gardeners will share with you tonight are not only beautiful to look at, but they also fit one or more of these program priorities. Some of the priorities that we're going to highlight are clean water and actions to minimize polluted runoff, water conservation, plants and practices that conserve water, pollinators, of course, attracting and supporting habitat for beneficial insects, climate change, creating resilient landscapes that adapt to a changing climate, and then also plant diversity and promoting stewardship of diverse ecosystems and encouraging the use of native plants. The landscape design firm hired by the county outlined a set of planting areas as well as goals that really aligned well with our Master Gardener Program priorities. Their goals were to include, to ensure a healthy, thriving, and beautiful landscape throughout the year, a 4 seasons type of landscape, to maintain an adaptive plant community that is able to change over time as conditions such as rainfall, temperature, and sunlight change, They recommended that fertilizing be kept to a minimum and supported plants that wouldn't require a lot of fertilization, and implemented only when necessary to correct particular deficiencies that were indicated by soil tests or observation. Excessive fertilization can lead to excessively lush growth, and that makes plants vulnerable to pests. And it also, as we heard tonight, allows unused nutrients to leach into the water. Plants and plant spacing were designed to fill the space and prevent weeds from germinating. And finally, they specified IPM, or integrated pest management practices, be used to deal with insects and disease. This targets specific problems and avoids broad spectrum pesticides that may harm beneficial pollinators and insects. So let's hear about these plants that you may have in your garden already or may be interested in adding to your garden. I'm happy to introduce you to 4 of our Island County Master Gardeners, all from Camano, and 2 of whom are just completing their training. They will share with us some of the plants that were chosen for the landscaping around the administration building. And as you saw in that previous screen, Judy Connington will go first. She is going to be talking about the entry beds and trees. Julie Dowell will talk about the drain field meadow. Adina Ray will talk about the entry meadow, and Carol Ann Ebert will talk about the plants in the bioswale. Okay, Judy.
Okay, sorry about my dogs barking just as you said my name. I figured they'd been quiet all night, and then that's when they would take off. The first plant that I wanted to talk about this morning was the Campanella Rotunda Folia. And personally, I like the common names. It's common harebell. I can remember those longer. The master gardening goal for those is water conservation. It's a good ground cover. It's perennial, which is nice. You don't have to replant it every year. You get these beautiful blue violet bellflowers in the summer, and then sometimes again in the fall it will rebloom. Works well in rock gardens. It likes shade, but it can do well in the sun. It attracts hummingbirds, pollinators, and it's deer resistant. It's a good choice for your home as well as for the bioswale. You have another one? Thank you. Trifolium, and this one I have trouble with, Wormskilde. I can't pronounce it, but it's cow's clover. This one's biodiversity, again, it's a good pollinator. The bees absolutely love this flower. And I've seen those in groves that bees are just everywhere. It's crazy how much they like this. It's a rhizome shrub herb type of plant, grows well in moist, wet areas and on coastal sand cliffs. It prefers sun and it can do well in partial shade. It does, I think, from what I've seen, it does better in sun. It blooms late spring and it has these beautiful deep magenta flowers. And like I said earlier, it's really good. The bees love it, but also it attracts the western cloudwing butterfly. You have another pic? Oh, there we go. Okay, this is one of my favorites because of the color. This is the vine maple. I'm just going to say the common name. I don't do well with the others. The master gardening goal for this is the plant biodiversity. This is a broadleaf deciduous tree, and it can actually grow kind of like a shrub or like a tree, and it can get to 20 feet high. So it's good for some lots, but you do have to maintain your height in a residential area, but it works good as an understory tree. It has multi-stems, and it can be coral, it can be green. It just depends on the variety that you get. It has beautiful color. It's upright growth. It grows in the sun. It loves the shaded forest. They grow everywhere in the forest. You'll see them all over. They have great fall color, red, yellow, orange, all different colors. And they attract birds and is usually a pest-free plant.
There we go. Thank you, Judy. We're going to next move on to the Drainfield Meadow, and we'll be hearing from Julie Dowell, who is one of our new Master Gardener trainees, just finishing up her last week of training this coming Saturday. Julie.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So my first flower that I got to learn all about is the woolly sunflower. The Master Gardener goal is it's a pollinator and water conservation. It's a perennial herb that gets to be up to 2 feet tall, and it tolerates a wide variety of soils. So that might be a great choice if someone wants to add it to their yard. And it prefers full sun. It also has hairs on the leaves and the stems, and that allows it to conserve water. It blooms from May through August, and it's, a sunflower-like bloom. Another fun fact about this plant is that Lewis and Clark collected the woolly sunflower along the Clearwater River in Idaho on June 6th of 1806. And then the next flower is the hooked spur violet. The Master Gardener goal is climate change and pollinator. It's a perennial with a heart-shaped flower or leaf-type flower. And it also has purple veins that it kind of draws bees to it by that. It adapts seasonally to saturated or droughty soil, which can be kind of perfect for some of the areas around our state. It prefers shade, and it's a pansy-like deep blue purple flower that blooms from April through August. And it's a butterfly habitat for endangered species. And then the last plant that I chose is the Deltoid balsam root. The Master Gardener goal is the pollinator. It's a perennial herb, and the maximum height is 35 inches. It grows best in dry soil, prefers full sun, and it's designated as endangered species in British Columbia. It blooms March through July, and it has yellow flowers, and it's also very beautiful.
Thank you, Julie. One of the questions that we get a lot from the public are, what can I plant on my drain field? And in general, you want to plant plants that have shallow root systems. This one's kind of an interesting one. Of course, not all of the plants that are in the drain field meadow are directly over the drain field. I'd be interested to know a little bit more about this one. If you look at the photo, you would think that perhaps it has a deep taproot because of the dry grass all around it and the plant being so green. But anyway, definitely the previous two that Julie talked about seem like they would be very appropriate for planting over a drain field. All right, next we are going to hear from Adina, and she is going to talk about the meadow plants that are along the entrance to the complex.
Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to be talking about my favorite Rybeez, red flowering currant. It is a beautiful plant, and it meets the Master Gardener goal of biodiversity. But let me tell you, who says biodiversity means boring? Nobody, not Rybeez. They're colorful, they're bright. They are a shrub for all seasons. They do get big. I have one that's the size of a small tree. They are beautiful. Suitable for sandy, well-drained soils, likes its sun, and it's a hummingbird magnet. It's just amazing. I'm also excited to talk about the Seashore Lupine, which is another beautiful plant. It meets the Master Gardener goal of water conservation, which is wonderful. It is perennial. It forms a mat. It is drought, salt, sand tolerant, which is great for those of us that live close to the ocean, prefers full sun. And it has the added benefit of fixing useful nitrogen. So that's a good thing. And from May to August, stunning purple, blue blooms. We all love them. They're great. And the last one, I am so lucky I get to talk about all these beautiful plants. The Western Columbine, again, meets the Master Gardener goal, plant biodiversity, but again, it's not boring. It's self-seeding perennial with fern-like foliage. It needs well-drained soils, which makes it great in a bioswale. It prefers full sun, will take some partial shade, and from March to August, red, yellow blooms. Who could ask for anything more?
Great, thank you, Adina. You and I are going to have to talk about the Master Gardener program priorities and how they are not boring.
Definitely not boring.
Okay, and last is Carol Ann Ebert. She is also a trainee who is just finishing up her training, and she's going to talk about the plants that were chosen, some of the plants that were chosen for the bioswale. Carol Ann, are you?
No, I just had to unmute. Thank you.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I am really excited because I got the bioswale to talk about and its plants. And certainly it's all of these plants are benefiting that landscape, but certainly this has probably the most ecological benefit, helping reduce and clean the stormwater runoff. The main attributes of all the three plants I'm going to talk about are that they adapt to very wet, which we have in the wintertime, to very dry, which we have in the summer's conditions in that bioswale. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Angelica arguta, also called Lyle's Angelica. And arguta comes from the Latin word for tooth or sharpness. Sometimes this is also called the sawtooth Angelica. The goal was clean water, and that's why it's in the bioswale itself. This plant is a native, so we also could have said biodiversity as a goal. And it runs from Canada, southern Canada, BC and Alberta, down all the way to California, and is west as far as Utah. It also grows from sea level to 9,000 feet, and it's present in both Mount Rainier and Olympic National Parks. It's a perennial herb, and it's part of the carrot family. And you've probably seen things called Queen Anne's lace and other ones that look like this. They're all part of that carrot family. And what's unique to them is they have a very deep taproot. They prefer moist forests or wetlands, full sun to partial sun. And as you can see, the beautiful flower, there are as many as 60 of those rays in some of these plants. And they flower, they begin in spring, they go all the way through late August. From a culinary standpoint, if you bruise the leaves of this, you can hear or can smell parsley or celery odor. And they are related to the same, in that carrot family. So they have dill, fennel, and caraway are in that. So it's kind of in that herby smell type thing. The foliage is very unique in that it's, very feathery and attracts a lot of bees and that type of thing. And in the national forest, both in Mount Rainier and in Olympic National Park, the bears love the spring foliage, so they eat that. The natives use the taproot for eating and for medicinal things. And I think we can go on to the next one. Okay, this one is Kamacia Kwamish. And Kwamish is the Nez Perce word for the bulb of this plant. So it has a bulb. And it's just, you can see the beautiful flowers in it. It runs from Canada, BC, and Alberta down to California and as far west as Montana. Historically, it was part of the Great Basin, which is Oregon, Nevada, Idaho, and Arizona. And there were huge prairies of this and meadows. And then the white man came in and grazed cattle on it and took this away. And it was a primary food substance for Native Americans, the indigenous people. And they would boil it and roast it, and it tasted like sweet potato. So it's a perennial herb, and it grows from 1 to 3 feet and has this beautiful grass-like foliage. It needs high moisture. It tolerates almost any kind of soil. It likes shady locations, but will tolerate sun. And you see that beautiful star flower that goes from late spring to early summer. And one of the things that this is ideal for is to plant around like retention ponds. So it's a nice border for something like that because they're usually wet. So if you have a retention pond or a kind of boggy area, this might make a pretty circle around that. Next one.
There it is.
Oh, and this turned out to be much like the flowering, the currant that we heard about. This has become my favorite plant, and I can't wait to see it at the Bioswale. It's called Carex pansa, and pansa means like splay-footed, that it kind of spreads out. And so you see this format, it's kind of a spreading looking plant. It's obviously clean water. It's a perennial grass that's actually evergreen until a frost comes along. A heavy frost will turn it kind of bronzy color and very fine textures. It grows about 8 inches tall and grows in almost any soil. It's drought tolerant, yet it will go through that rainy period we have. And that's why it's good for this bioswale. And it prefers full sun to partial shade. It's an excellent ground cover if you want a natural lawn or meadows. And this is what I found fascinating. So people actually plant this for a lawn, and they can mow it from 2 to 4 times a year. It only needs fertilizer to establishment. After that, you really don't have to fertilize it. So if you have a lawn that you just want looking green, but you're not really walking on it, it's not your croquet court or that type of thing, this is a really neat alternative. And, with you don't put the fertilizer on it. You can mow it 2 to 4 times. If you walk on it a lot, if it's in a traffic area, then you need to fertilize it more. In landscapes that are more commercial, they really use it around sidewalks, that type of thing, because it does help absorb the runoff. And other things that are done, if you are like a botanical garden and you have a border, this can go in the border and it covers up the sprinkler heads because it's so feathery, the water can bounce up to it and get to the other plants. So it's a good camouflage for that. It's used in rain gardens and bioswales, and it's going to be my next plant in my garden.
Very good. Thank you so much, Carol Ann. And thank you to all of our master gardeners who participated tonight. I really appreciate your help in putting this presentation together, doing your research, and it's been a fun project. So you can visit these plants and more. There are many more that were not highlighted tonight. This is at the new Camano Administrative Building, which is at 121 Northeast Camano Drive. One word of caution, these plants were only planted last fall, and so they're very small. So you're not going to see the beautiful blooms. Maybe some of them will put on some blooms this year, but it'd be fun to come in and see how the landscape takes off. And master gardeners are available to help you with choosing plants. One of the things that we talk about a lot is making sure that you have chosen the right plant for the right place. So considering the soil type, considering the the water needs and water availability, shade, microclimates, things like that. And master gardeners have been trained in using appropriate and science-based resources to help choose the right plant for the right place. And we can also help you locate those resources as well. So thank you very much for everyone for joining us tonight. If anyone has any further questions, you can call our Master Gardener hotline, which is that bottom number right there. And you'll leave a message and a Master Gardener will get in touch with you and help decide how best to answer your questions. And we look forward to being back in person at plant clinics and hopefully this summer. We'll see how that all goes. But let me just check.
Lauren?
Yes.
Lauren,
Yes.
on behalf of the Master Gardeners and trainees at Camano, we would thank you very much for this opportunity. It was a wonderful educational opportunity for us.
Great. Thank you. And one of the questions was, will slides of this presentation be available? Yes, it has been recorded. And I believe you should all get, if you've registered and you have, that you will all get a copy of the, a link to the presentation. I can also provide a copy of the plant lists as well. And I think that's it. All right, great. Thank you very much, everyone.
That was good. I'm free. Over.
Good.
Wasn't that good?
Good job, yes.
Wasn't that?
Very
And
good.
he did my editing so beautifully. I mean, he
Well,
really
you-
did.
You said enough.
Yeah, and because I told him, I said, I don't know all the words, but I just put it out there and I make believe, and you can go in and put the facts in it.